It's actually a privilege for me to welcome
Добрый
you.
день, доброе утро. Мне очень приятно вас приветствовать.
I'm sorry because we can actually hear the Russian interpretation, and if it's possible, can you stop screen sharing so we can start with the seeing each other? Thanks a lot. So we are back for a second beginning. Okay, that was a fake. This is the real one. Good morning and good afternoon. It's a privilege for me to welcome you all here in this thematic session on monitoring and adapting. This is actually within the ETF UNESCO International Conference Week. I also would like to welcome our audience for our social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I'm Simona Rinaldi. I work at the ETF. I'm not alone here, as you can see, it's plenty of colleagues, but in particular, I think it's worth to thanks my voice, actually, where we have Mihailo Milovanovic, Senior Human Capital Development Expert, and Hugo Mussi, Head of System Performance and Assessment Unit. We will be the three together, but we won't be only us, it will be many of us. We have a few discussants together with us, and actually it will be a privilege being all together and sharing this session with all of you. Before we officially start, I would like just to share with all of us, including attendees, some instruction on how the Zoom webinar works. As you can see from the slide, actually the Zoom webinar is very similar to the regular Zoom, but you have two channels in order to put forward questions. You have the question and answer icon button, where actually always please select question to the host and to the panelists, which means that at least us, we will be able to see your questions, but those are posted anonymously. So if you have a question only for us, panelists, discussants, and now I'm referring to our attendees, please use the question and answer. If you want to make a comment or even a question, let's say that this time we make an exception, please use the chat for comments and always select to all panelists and attendees. So to recap, if you wish to go public and to talk to all of us, you use the chat, comments, and you address these to all panelists and attendees. And that's it, actually, when it comes to instructions for you. You can actually see that we are within the ETF conference week, and I think that we can share to our participants where we are within the ETF conference week, which is a week which is composed by we can actually share where we are in the conference, which actually this is a week composed by 3 days of thematic session that are leading to 1.5 days of high-level event, which will be actually held on Thursday and Friday. So having said that, okay, we couldn't see where we are in the week, but it's okay. I hope I guided you through anyway. I think that we will have the time to present all of you as discussants. And if you are ready to start, I think that I can pass the floor to my colleague Hugo Mussi. Are you ready? I guess so. I know you cannot talk, it's a Zoom webinar. So actually, but I assume you're ready. And so Hugo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Good afternoon for some of you. Well, just a few words maybe to introduce this session on monitoring and adapting, and the reason why we wanted to have this session. It appears to a lot of us that today education and training are very much under pressure to adapt to a context of prominent changes, such as the response to be brought to the ecological crisis, the ongoing digitalization, global migrations and mobility, or multidimensional inequities over the world. So across the ETF partners countries, a new generation of policies is emerging which aim at changing education and training system in response to these developments so they can cater for an increasingly diverse group of learners. These changes are conceived and implemented in highly diverse, dynamic, and often unpredictable environments, which are rich in opportunities, but also in risks. Such environments require progress to be constantly monitored and adjustment made to ensure that reforms remain relevant, on target, and to the benefit of all stakeholders. So what kind of monitoring systems can capture the magnitude, the pace, and diversity of reforms at national, regional, international level, while delivering reliable results on a regular basis about progress towards lifelong learning? This is a vast question indeed. And within this broader question, three areas invite reflection and will be very much the focus of the session that we are in today. So first question would be, what do we need to monitor to arrive at reliable judgments about success or failure of system change towards lifelong learning? What do we need to monitor? Second broad question will be, how do we monitor in a way so that various perspectives and stakeholders' interests are considered in the monitoring process? And third question is, how do we use and should we use the monitoring results, the data evidence from monitoring, and what is the purpose? How should it be done? So we'll spend 2 hours together trying to address or respond to these questions and better understand the landscape of monitoring in the framework of system change towards lifelong learning. So let me quickly introduce the agenda, maybe also the setup of this session. So we'll cover the theme, monitoring and adapting, over 2 sessions. The first session will deal with what I would call the upstream part of monitoring, so to say, what is needed to monitor in a relevant way, both in terms of data and evidence and process. And in a second session, we will deal with the downstream part of monitoring. So the use of monitoring products at large in the decision-making process, in the policy-making process. So that's the 2 subsessions, so to say, that we will go through. A little bit of the setup. So in our session, we will first invite speakers to drive us through their thinking, their experience, and then we'll turn to our panelists or discussants to react and share their own experience. They are online here with us. But we will also interact with the broader audience on various platforms. So please, all along this session or these 2 sub-sessions, ask your questions that will be reflected and upon which we can discuss. Simona, is there anything to add on this session?
No, actually we're perfect as usual. So everything was there. So nothing to add apart passing the floor immediately, actually, to our first speaker, which I'm very glad to introduce, who is Hiromichi Katayama, Senior Program Specialist at UNESCO. So Hiromichi, the floor is yours, and thank you so much, Hugh, for this introduction.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Hiromichi Katayama. I'm from the UNESCO headquarters in the section of Tibet, and I'm going to talk about the monitoring, especially about the what kind of data available and how we have been using our data for our own operations. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it now. Okay. So yes, I will continue. And
perfect. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand that I have 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm going to talk about the what we are doing in the area of Tibet technical education and vocational training. But I think when we conduct our Tibet policy review and then the development of the policy, and then provide a support for the policy implementation to our member countries. Yes, of course, our main target is the vocational training and technical education, but we are also looking at the entire skills development systems, including the secondary education and also a part of the higher education, tertiary education, and also any other education and training opportunities for adults. And we would like to ensure this lifelong learning perspective. So usually, we start by conducting the situation analysis, we call it policy review, by collecting relevant data, doing the analysis, and preparing a kind of policy recommendation to the countries. And then if our member countries want us to continue our support, we are providing a policy development. And then if we can mobilize the financial resources to provide more in-depth support. We provide a policy implementation support, including the development of the legal framework, institutional arrangements, teacher training, etc., etc. And the use of data, identification and analysis of the data, and the use of the data analysis has been a critical component throughout this process. And I'm showing the diagram that we created almost 10 years ago with OECD, the World Bank, and ILO. And actually, this was requested by the G20 Development Working Group. And they have asked the international organization to identify the existing available data to better capture the landscape of skills development. And we have identified what kind of data and indicators are available in a cross-country comparable manners under each international organizations. And at that time, I was at the UNESCO Institute for Statistics in Montreal, and I was heavily involved in this initial exercise. So I'm not going to explain all of them in detail, but if you look at the title, we pay attention to the contextual factors like macroeconomic and macro-social indicators. And then we pay attention to the skills acquisitions, the status of skills acquisition by individuals, and also the skills requirements, what kind of skills are demanded by the labor market. And also, if you look at the circle in the middle, matching, what kind of mismatch exists in each countries. And then we pay attention to the outcomes, the labor market outcomes, and also the social outcomes. And after we prepare the conceptual framework, OECD took over this task, and they have developed the database. So now if you can go to the OECD's database, you see all of this data in a comprehensive manner available on the OECD's website. But I would like to say that this exercise was, the main objective was to create a cross-country comparable database. But when we provide a country-specific analysis and country-specific support, we more or less pay attention to the same kind of indicators. And at the country levels, we can get more in-depth and more granular level of data and indicators. And that will allow us to make more to the point policy advice and policy implementation support. But I think we are also facing some challenges of data, because usually the skills development is fragmented by different ministries, and the data are located in many different places. So at least we'd like to ensure the identifying and also collecting the data from education ministry and labor ministries at least. And also we would like to get the data from the private sectors, like a Chamber of Commerce, trade unions, and employers, industry associations, and try to put them together into one place and to discuss the implication of the data, and also they try to ensure the evidence-based policy advice. But still, the use of data is challenging, and also the comparability of data is challenging. They use their own taxonomy, and the data are not produced in a coherent and consistent manner. So I would say that this is one of the challenges that we are facing now. And I would like to briefly mention the big data analytics and artificial intelligence as a complementary data source. And in order to get the timely and real-time data from the skills needs and the skills supply in the labor market, UNESCO has been trying to work with the online job board in some of the developing countries, middle income and low income countries. And usually in some countries, the companies posted their job vacancies announcement on their website, and job seekers occasionally they upload their CVs on their website, and they use the online job search platforms when they look for a job by the individuals, and also when the companies look for a new labor force for their companies. And we have a partnership with the technical companies who has an expertise of conducting the data mining and also the statistics analysis of this kind of unstructured data, and also the produce some analysis by using their own taxonomy using the artificial intelligence. Analysis and artificial intelligence. So for example, this is something we produced with the company called JobCred based in Singapore in Palestine, using the data of job vacancy in 2020. So we have contacted the company called jobs.ps, and the companies put the job vacancies for university graduates in the jobs.ps, which is an online job search platform. And we got the big data from the job descriptions. It's a very unstructured data first. And then we are working with this company, JobCred, to do the cleaning and then do the analysis of to identify what kind of job titles are demanded in the Palestinian labor market by targeting white-collar university graduates workers in Palestine in 2020. And you see the name of the top 20 job titles in the Palestinian job market in 2020. And in addition to the job titles, we were able to identify what kind of skills are demanded in the Palestinian job market for white-collar jobs for university graduates. And you see what kind of skills are demanded in the Palestinian labor market, like English, communication, management. I think it is pretty much focused on the soft skills. But I would say that this can provide some complementary information for us to think about what kind of policy advice we should give to the Palestinian government, because of course we conducted the statistical analysis based on the information that we obtained from the labor force survey. But what we can get is the number of workers by occupation and by industries, and we were not able to get this kind of in-depth and granular level of information for Palestine. But in addition to the traditional labor market information analysis, we think that it will be worthwhile to try to use this non-traditional data, like an online job search platform in the context of Palestine. And then thereby we can provide a more real-time and a more granular level of policy advice to the government of Palestine. So I think I would like to conclude my short speech.
Thank you so much, Hiromichi, because you see we have here Barba Mama coming, so you have 1 minute to go, and then I just put her down, and I leave you 1 more minute because you've been so good. So go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, I mean this is my last slide. So we think that a kind of integrated approach is needed. So of course we have to continue to do the analysis of the administrative data and the survey data, as most of us have already been done. But in addition to that, I think we may need to do think about using this non-traditional data like online job search platforms. And also in some countries, international survey data is available. The World Bank has conducted the enterprise survey in many countries. And also we can think about doing the qualitative approach, like a skills foresight, opinion surveys, and also the focus group interviews. So in short, we think that this kind of holistic and comprehensive approach will be needed so that we can have a better understanding of the labor market in a timely manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hiromichi. It was a pleasure. Actually, I think it's very important, really, well, you know the importance of data, I don't have to tell you, and really to focus on what kind of policy advice to give, because this is really actually why data are so important. But I think that to talk about data, I'm for sure not the best person here in the room. And I think that we have a very good person here in the room, just next to me, who is Mihailo, Senior Human Capital Development Expert. So Mihailo, the floor is yours. Please enlighten us.
Thank you very much. In fact, I have my presentation somewhere on your computer, so I'll try to fetch it.
Okay, in the meantime, I can entertain you. Tell me if you want more of Barba Mamma, or if we can simply wait Mihailo with the presentation. Excellent, we are coming. You see, the beauty and the beast of online. We all need a lot of patience, but we are there. The first one.
Okay, the first one.
You see, we want to create some suspense around the presentation of Mihailo, and I think we made it.
Okay.
Now the floor is really yours.
Thank you very much. So essentially what just happened shows you that even if you have the best of arrangements, the best of technical decisions, the best of ideas, at some point life takes over and you never really know, are things going to work out the way they're supposed to or not? And so following the presentation of Hiromichi, who shared experiences also from his work at UNESCO, I thought that perhaps I should sort of justify ourselves. Why do we want to discuss process? Usually when I hear the word process, I imagine something that is rather ordinary, probably boring, complex, and perhaps we can skip it and get to the point. This is kind of my initial reaction, but one of the major sources of insights that we have regarding monitoring at the ETF is the Torino process, and what we also know from the Torino process, we know different things, but is that in fact ultimately once everything is said and done, whether things work out or not, whether decision makers follow the advice or not, what Simona was referring to, actually depends on people. And so the Torino process has this kind of advantage that it could serve both as a tool that informs about what countries are exactly doing, but also it really holds a wealth of information regarding how to do things and perhaps how not to do things, also regarding monitoring. And so as you see, we set it up some time ago with the idea that if we ask a sufficient number of questions, if we talk regularly enough with people, and if we take very wise decisions about the indicators we want to cover, things are going to work out. And they largely did. We did have the round since 2010. Every 2 years, we do have a number of country reports and so on and so on. But in addition to this content aspect, the aspect where we look into the data, perhaps in a slightly less complex and rich way than what we heard from Hiromichi, but still we do look at the number of data and questions. In addition to that, we also had this ambition that we kind of need to be sure that the information we receive, the data we choose, is something that people actually understand, because ultimately our results are coming from them and going back to them, right? And this is something that we're going to hear in the third part of the session. And so the idea was that we want to build consensus with the Torino process. This has always been the motto and the commitment. We want to determine the state of the art and vision, but not only that, we also want to be sure that partners with whom we work in the countries also sort of understand and agree on that. And so throughout the time we have been implementing the Torino process, we had this list of questions, but we also had this principles, which we always try to uphold, despite the changes from round to round, the adaptations of the questions, the changes in the data and all that. And so these kind of principles, they seem very logical, maybe intuitive, even that, you know, of course, we want to promote ownership. We want broader participation in the process of evidence collection, monitoring, and conclusions. We want to focus not only on one provider and on one small segment of the system, but to have a more holistic view. And of course, we want to do all this in order to get the evidence we need. And you know, the funny thing is that over almost a decade now, we realize that nobody questions our intentions. And yes, we agree on the data, and we agree that the process should be inclusive. and reliable, but somehow countries have always been struggling to a certain extent, and we too, to actually achieve this goal, to really have comprehensive participation always and under all circumstances, to make sure that everybody agrees with the choice of data we're covering, and most of all, that they're all comfortable and have this kind of a sense of ownership over the findings, and that the people actually ready to follow up. So one of the lessons we learned, and this is actually a very constructive lesson, is that that in fact, if you talk about involvement, if you talk about the process of monitoring, there is this technical way of discussing this, and if you look at it from the point of view of individuals involved who come with their own personal stories, but also with their institutional and formal responsibilities, you really have a very large diversity of potential players, which means that in fact they come into the game, they come into this discussion of contributing to a monitoring process with their own luggage, in a good and also in a more problematic sense of the word. You have this kind of a landscape of change. It's a slide I've used once before, so some of you might know it, but it's proven its value as an illustration of reality. Is in fact, you do have this sort of a scale, or how to say, you have this kind of a difference in perceptions and points of view, perspectives, starting from people who are on the front line of education and training provision and going high up to the international organizations where we are. I don't know whether our location in this map is always sunny and nice. Sometimes it's not, but definitely there is a certain bridge that we always need to build between what we see and what we think is the right approach, and what people who are on the front line see, and then all of these players who are in between. So depending where you are here, you might have a completely different perspective. You might be much more focused on resolving daily problems. And when you talk about monitoring, collecting evidence and acting on it, you might wish to resolve the problem that you have right now. Whereas we might see a slightly more distant, bigger helicopter view type of picture. And so if we all come together in the same room and commit with it in the Torino process to having an inclusive, participatory, and as reliable as possible action in order to agree on what is going on and monitor reforms, sometimes we realize that we are either not using the same language or we have different perspectives, and to ensure complementarity is sometimes not that easy. So in this way, there is really a number of perhaps trade-offs or healthy compromises which must be met and which one should be aware of, thinking that it is not only about technical decisions, but also about people and convincing people to in fact participate and follow up on the results of monitoring, on the results of the analysis. And these trade-offs, perhaps, the compromises, I mean, I just started the list, but I hope that we can maybe continue it. It's really, you have like just a small selection that, for example, if you are very unilateral in the way you design a monitoring process, very likely you're going to have consensus. Sometimes, of course, we are in disagreement with ourselves. This happens sometimes to people, but in general, if the less people, the more like-minded they are, the more likely is it that you're going to have a consensus about what data you use and how to interpret them. Whereas if you go towards the direction of inclusion and of opening up to a wide range of stakeholders, this kind of becomes more challenging. And of course, it's not a black and white game. You're always somewhere more to the left or more to the right. So with the Torino process, we've always tried to be somehow in the middle and more towards this kind of a direction of inclusion. But this has not always been easy, just because of these different perspectives, different starting points, different interests that are in the game. Also, the more people involved, the more complex the process of monitoring is, the more difficult it will be to actually find the right balance between the speed, sometimes we need information immediately, and accuracy. And also another example is about scope and relevance. As you know, if you go and talk big, the bigger you talk, the more likely it is that you might lose actually some of the details that you perhaps need in order to formulate proper policy advice. So all of these trades-offs, this is just a preliminary list that I just wanted to throw here, because I know that my input is not meant to provide answers and to resolve all questions, but actually to prepare us for subsequent discussion. So if I have to summarize, and these are these question marks down there, what I'm trying to say with these 5 minutes, and this kind of a half unfinished slides before the Mama Barbara comes, is that all solutions we might have and all technical ideas we have, and even the most precise selection of evidence, we should always keep in mind that ultimately we must also apply this in reality, and how successful we are with that depends on people. And I don't mean the personal stories of people only, I also mean that they all have, we were talking about a diversity of participants, and we're talking about the reliability of monitoring process, which depends on our ability to involve these people and agree on a healthy compromise. What exactly do we want to monitor, and most importantly, how? I'm going to finish here. I don't have a slide with a thank you because it's just the beginning of a discussion, I hope.
Okay, so
I'm really
actually,
scared of this.
yes, you see, actually, you know that in the past we were actually using the bell to keep the time, but it's very old-fashioned. So we thought that the eyes of Barba Mama would be even more persuading, and in fact they are. So having said that, thank you so much to both of our speakers, and I pass the floor to Hugo, and I think it's also the time for all of us to share our ideas. Hugo, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for these two presentations, which was very enlightening. So we saw on this side, what I call the upstream side, both what key elements are needed, the more, let's say, technical part that engages us towards, the kind of indicators, the analytical and statistical treatment, but also now data mining and the use of artificial intelligence, especially maybe to foresee a little bit this kind of skills that are important for companies, that are important for societies at large, and then to develop. And we went also down with these process elements on things that could appear a little bit softer, so to say, which actually are not, with this idea of consensus building, the interplay of actor, everything that in a sense we could call, a particular sense, the political economy of factors, which is very important and was actually very much highlighted in a work, especially not only, but I remember what the World Bank in the World Development Report in 2018, trying, to put all actors to align them so to get to a common goal. So a landscape that is already just on this upstream part, I think very, very vast. We now have, I think, around 20 minutes to engage the discussion based on this presentation with first our discussants, which I would like now to turn to. And let me begin with, I think, a very basic and direct question. What part of these inputs, of these reflections that we just heard, relate to your own professional experience, but also to the country context, and how? So who would like to begin, and based on that to react and dig deeper into your own experience? The floor is yours. Please don't be shy.
Well, I can begin.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Ronit Ashkenazi, and I'm from Israel, the Amal Educational Network. We have worked on the Torino process for like 10 years, I think, many years. We prepared the Torino process, the report of Israel by ourselves, and we find out that the data and the monitoring the data is very important, because as was written in both presentations, we first dig it and then we analyze it and we pass all the process. What I would like to share with you now is one example. And the example is our experience during the COVID-19 time, what we call the last year crisis, and how we can adapt our system according to the data we mine, the data we share, and how can we learn from the data in real time and to make changes at the system. So first of all, we use the LMS system, educational LMS, for collecting data. It can be basic data, like how many students learned during e-learning when they were at home, or hybrid learning when some students were at home and some students were in classrooms. And we want really to know if students are learning or not, with us or not, or they just open the computer and run away. So we try to monitor the presence of the students, but that was not enough. And we have to see how deep they're going with their learning. If they learn seriously, if they ask questions, if they are engaged in the classrooms, and if they understand what they are learning, because, you know, it's very different when a student is in the classroom with the teacher or without. So we collect this data in mainly two ways. One way was questionnaires and surveys, but I think the deeper one was through LMS system like Google Classrooms and Microsoft Teams, where students were working at these systems, and they have an analytical report which we gathered in our network, but not only. Also, the Ministry of Education gathers these analytical results, and we try to find out if all the system works. You know, we were talking about e-learning and hybrid learning for many, many years, but now we have it in live. And we try it, and we have to check if it works or not works, and how it works, and we have to change the policy according to the data that we have get. And I think it was a small laboratory of all what we were discussing about, using it during the COVID-19 time, when we have to change the system and see how it works. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anit, for this, for sharing this experience. It's very true that in monitoring, and it was also dealt with by Hiromichi and Mihailo, there's a time scale that is important. You can monitor in the long term, but sometimes you need to monitor things quickly to readjust, especially when confronted to a crisis such as the one we had to face last year. I see hands raised, and I'm sorry because I don't know exactly when you raised your hand. So
Pedro.
Oh, okay, Pedro
is the first.
Thank you. I would like to just comment. Of course, I work at the International Labour Organization. I'm a lifelong learning specialist, and also work in this area of policies and systems. And I would like to, I like very much this last intervention because it goes very much in the direction of what I wanted to say. I think that in monitoring, as you explained in your note that you distributed, we're trying to create good narratives on lifelong learning and how it contributes to national targets, also global targets. But we are talking about a very, very wide ecosystem. So we're not talking only about formal education and training. We're talking about apprenticeships, work-based learning. We're talking about recognition of prior learning, labor market information, career guidance support, so a wide number of things. So the monitoring exercise becomes immediately complex because of the amount of organizations and stakeholders involved in it. And so on that level, the Torino process is quite notable for trying to look into a wide range of aspects. What I think is that frequently monitoring tends to look more at trends than exactly impacts. This is not an issue only in the monitoring of lifelong learning. It exists in many areas simply because it's easier. The indicators are already there. It's what in the SAE interagency report was called first generation indicators mostly. So they're usually easier to gather, but we tend to have a weaker understanding of what are the processes involved, the interactions involved between the agents, what are the really important contextual factors which affect the impact of the reforms. And more than that, we need to have, let's say, monitoring systems which are adapted to the reforms we're trying to monitor. Furthermore, I would suggest that monitoring is not enough. We need to have an understanding of, we need to have evaluation linked to the monitoring to really check if changes which occur are actually a fruit of the reforms which are being implemented. Just trying to be very quick, because I took note of a number of ideas. I think that it is important to combine quantitative and qualitative data. Qualitative data fundamentally on aspects linked to governance and to institutional elements. I think it's very important, and eventually use simple basic research strategies like triangulation when you're asking the questions to the people who are providing the information. And I think it's important to study to the extent possible the existence of causality between the policies and the impacts on specific groups. And on that level, it's also important to think about what are the key groups, vulnerable groups, people working in the informal economy, people working in small and medium enterprises, which is where the majority of the employment is. Also, what was briefly mentioned, also the issue of scope, and I'll stop now, because frequently the impacts which are interesting are not necessarily individual impacts or aggregations of individual impacts. Sometimes a relevant impact is at community level. So for example, are we measuring that? So I'll leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pedro. But we had the Barba Mama coming. So thank you so much. It was super inspiring. There is so much to say, but let's try to be short as much as we can, as we were being so far. It was excellent. So I can release Barba Mama first, and I pass the floor back to Hugo.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pedro. I think what you also touch on is really the articulation between monitoring and then what comes usually next or with it, assessment or evaluation, whatever we call it, and the sense of impact, and also results in the perspective of causality, but also unexpected results that could come from any kind of policy. So I have now back the list. So I think, Raul, you're next. So please, Raul.
Thank you, Hugh, very much. This is Raúl Valdés from the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. I would briefly would like to stand upon the importance of the potential envisaged for lifelong learning, both as a social good and economic imperative. And in that sense, I think that still a formal system for monitoring, a system that clearly reflects the learning that is taking place, it's still missing. So I would really follow up on the two very important presentations. The importance of monitoring lifelong learning systems need to include, but really extend beyond formal education. What is happening at the non-formal level? And we have very, very low information on that. This means monitoring in one way the implementation of non-degree programs, for example, provided by formal education institutions, such as those organized by universities to increase community engagement. I'm thinking of the third mission of universities, but also means monitoring structured learning opportunities organized by other institutions and organizations. What may be term of non-formal learning programs, and I'm talking about community learning centers, libraries, workplaces. In that sense, today for lifelong learning, we have a lot of challenges for monitoring what is really happening in order to make a system change. Monitoring should extend beyond physical learning spaces, of course, and very much taking the online courses. And on that basis, to monitoring measures to gauge the success or failure of systems change toward lifelong learning, we need really to correlate with national priorities for the implementation of lifelong learning. as identified in implementing strategies or action plans for the implementation of national lifelong learning policies. We have the cases now of Cambodia, Laos, PDR, that they're developing their lifelong learning strategies with specific, very specific strategies and infrastructure indicators to promote lifelong learning. The last important point, these priority actions can inform the development of indicators to improve teaching, but also legal foundations and mechanisms such as the validation, accreditation of non-formal and informal learning outcomes. So this could, in a way, help us to establish already some pathways that are crucial to follow up on the implementation of lifelong learning.
Thank you, Raul. Thank you very much. The importance also of monitoring what is being done into informal or non-formal is very important. I think it's Dan Wagner. I don't know whether he measured it or he just picked it in one of his books, said that what research on non-formal and informal education is only like 10% or less than 10% of all research on education, though what happens here might be as important as 25% or a third of all the kind of things that people do learn. So there is this imbalance that I think is very important and should be also reflected when it comes to monitoring. Irina. Irina Shumik.
Hello, everyone. I'm Irina Shumik from the Ministry of Education and Science, and actually I'm responsible for vocational education here in Ukraine. And I want to underline that the monitoring is very important for the reform implementation. And maybe you know that 5 years ago, the VET system here in Ukraine were just decentralized. And it was like a huge step for, but very surprised step for the regions, because we are a very big country and we have 25 regions. And they didn't know what they should do with the system of vocational education. And actually, our participation in Torino process was very helpful for the further implementation. And they want maybe name some 3 topics, three points, what was very important. Actually, it was helped us to optimize the network of vocational institutions, because we had like a lot of numbers of schools, but the quantity of students is low right now. And also we had started establishing of new occupations and designing new standards and new curriculum for this occupation. And also it was improved like cooperation with the employers, because it's a very important part for the quality of vocational education. And we see that we have some like gaps with skills analysis, and we also want to provide maybe some researches in this sphere. But what we understand now, that during the reform of vocational education here in Ukraine, we need more information. And we also need a special system for collecting, for analyzing this data. That's why we have started also the development of EMIS system here in Ukraine. And it's supposed that it will be finishing by the next year. And also we have some very big expectations for the system, and maybe in the future it will be possible to integrate LMS system for each school to this national EMIS system. So what we see now, that also it's very important, and we understand that this monitoring should also to have transformation according to the new situations, to the new tendencies that we have right now.
Irina. So I think we are kind of running a little bit out of time. So Elena and Ahmed, I know you want to react, and you're very welcome to do it, but we'll need, unfortunately, if you can stick to 2 minutes each, that would be perfect. Sorry about that. Please, Elena.
And remember, Barba Mamma is here with us, watching you both. Take the challenge, 2 minutes each. Thank you. Irina, you are muted. Elena, I'm sorry, apologies.
Yes.
For. Thank you.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you. I wanted to relate to something that Hiromichi had said about the necessity to agree, well, the results of and the procedures of monitoring, apparently, if the monitoring is done by different providers. But my experience is that if the real intention of the providers is to camouflage the real outcomes of their reforms, then the clients are likely to get very mixed data from these kinds of providers and from those who are trying to do the real job. The reform of school education in Moscow started 10 years ago, and the intention was, the declared intention was to bring closer together the opportunities for all children, because there was some discrepancy between how the schools were funded. The decision was to merge several schools into a bigger complex so that schools can get more money towards, some kind of equipment and stuff, and so that they could have more opportunities for best performing students. The decision to monitor the outcomes of this reform was very interesting. They decided, the city government, those who actually orchestrated this reform, decided to monitor only the top performance. Also, they decided to monitor top performance numerically. That is, the schools that have more top performers will be better funded, will be better supported than the school that has less top performers. Since the schools were merged, the bigger the school, the more top performers it's likely to get. It wasn't calculated in numerically, it was calculated just in terms of how many. So the success of the reform was therefore apparent. Now that the schools have been merged, each school has more top performers than previously. So with some stakeholders, the trick was not discovered even. Oh yes, so wonderful, so many top performance. Negative results were not monitored at all. Again, the amount of dropouts, the amount of children who didn't score at the appropriate level was not monitored at all. And this was in schools and in vocational colleges as well, because these were also merged. So what I'm saying is that monitoring sometimes is a very dangerous instrument if it is used with certain purposes by certain people. The civil society organizations simultaneously were doing similar monitoring, and they discovered several things: that as a consequence of this reform, what was intended, greater equity, actually the outcomes were completely opposite to that. Schools that have been merged immediately started grouping students according to their academic achievement, putting them even in separate school buildings. And the ones that were performing better. We're getting best teachers because teachers also got extra bonuses for better performance of their students. So again,
thank you.
Okay, if my time is up, I will probably stop here.
Yeah, thank you. But thank you, because it was really very enlightening to point out these the side effects or dangers, so to say, the caution we need to put into monitoring. Ahmed, it's a real challenge for you because we have very few time.
Okay,
but the floor is yours.
I'll try to be very quick. I'll just three quick themes that I will reflect on from the perspective of Egypt's experience that were discussed by colleagues. First of all, the issue, the holistic point of view. Egypt has a very diverse and somewhat fragmented vet system, and this is really a big challenge. How to see this monitoring and evaluation on a holistic perspective, not just the monitoring and evaluation of specific programs or initiatives, but the whole thing. This is quite challenging. The ownership, again, we participate in the Torino process. We have a national committee that works on this, on the process, on the report. But what happens after that, between the reports? There's still this missing entity that overlooks this kind of monitoring. We're working now with, for example, the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development to have this bird's eye view and to control this, because they do not have the implementation part of TVET, whether formal or non-formal. So maybe that could be the future going on, and especially that they are responsible for sustainable development visions and strategies for the whole country, so they can link what's happening in labor market and TVET areas. The third area is also the resources. What kind of resource systems, procedures that are in place, and the human resources that need to do this in such a large and diverse economy. Many players that present their data in different ways, as Hamishimi mentioned. All these are challenges that we are living every day in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, because you kept your time, but at the same time said, I think, three very important points that we'll need, I think, to discuss at some point. Thanks for your sharing your experience and highlighting these elements with us. Simona, what's next? What comes next?
What's next, actually? We have a surprise for you, because you thought you were talking freely like this, but at the end of the day, we had someone behind the scene taking the notes, and now our dear Alessandro, the spy of the meeting, basically, will screen share, actually is already screen sharing, what we collected. And I think from your discussion, what we thought were our key messages, and I would like to pass the floor to our colleague Carmo, who took note out of it, just to guide us through. Carmo, you have 3 minutes. Barba Mama is next to you. Be careful. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Simona. I hope you can hear me well. And I'm going straight forward to present what I take from this discussion, which was very rich and very, I would say, interesting. So I tried to organize my notes looking at the type of evidence that we can use on monitoring process, the use that we do of that evidence, and what are the challenges on setting up the monitoring process. And on the type of evidence, is clear that there is a kind of agreement that we will need to combine different types of evidence, meaning that this could be a combination between quantitative and qualitative indicators as a first input, but also, and that is, I would say, the novelty of the times that we are living, that we need to combine non-classical indicators or non-classical information with the classical sources of information like the statistical data. So it was very interesting to hear about all this information on the use of big data analysis that is now possible to be made because there is a lot of information available on, for instance, the vacancies that are posted online, or the ones that Israel used for addressing the issues of COVID, or the issues that were emerging during the COVID-19 crisis, using, for instance, the analytics from Google. So this is something that is new, I would say, and that is a new insight to the way that we look at the type of evidence. There is also, of course, the reference to the much needed existence of information and management systems at country level, where the robustness of the data can be somehow assessed, the information can be gathered, regularly updated, and I think that some country examples shows, like the one in Ukraine, that this is still a challenge, but is a challenge that the countries are looking at in order to set up education management and information systems, or labor market information and management systems. So on the type of evidence, these were the main message, but I would also highlight the idea that we need to go beyond the formal education. So if we want to monitor lifelong learning, or having lifelong learning in perspective, we need to go to areas that usually the education and training monitoring frameworks were not looking at. So we need to capture what goes beyond the physical classrooms, namely on digital, and we need to tackle also the non-formal and informal learning. Now, on the use of evidence, how we can use this evidence? It was very clear that there are, of course, these two trends that evidence can be used for policy development by the country policy makers, and this is, of course, one of the main reasons why the countries will collect so much information. But there is also, from the side of international organizations, experts, consultants, this idea that collecting information is very important for providing the best policy advice for system reform and for policy development. So there is a combination between the use of evidence by the country policymakers, the country authorities, the country stakeholders, and the international organization or other external actors that usually have to provide or are requested to provide advice to the governments or to policymakers. There was also this very interesting idea on the use of data more from the methodological perspective. So the idea that we need to triangulate the analysis that we do, so using different methods, different techniques, and then use this evidence in this way, not looking at only one side of the story, but looking from different sides of the story, and linked to this, the participation of the different stakeholders. So having the voices heard from the different stakeholders, which is, I would say, an added value, but also has risks, as the ones that have been pointed out, that monitoring can also be seen or can be also be biased if the participation of the different stakeholders has this initial purpose of having a biased result. There was also this idea that monitoring and evidence should be used for tackling unexpected crises. And I think this is also a signal of our times. And in particular, because of COVID, I think that many countries have faced this issue of we need to have data to understand what is going on, and then to have the possibility of designing the best policies. Of course, this was all done in a very short time, but it shows the importance of having regular and reliable monitoring systems in place, because this would help to react quickly. And lastly, on the process, on the monitoring process, I will pick this idea that that Pedro mentioned from ILO, that we are trying to make a combination that is almost missing mission impossible. Because from one hand, we will have more complex and holistic and wider frameworks for monitoring the entire system, the entire lifelong learning panorama. But at the same time, we are looking for having good and simple narratives for quick fix solutions or for the best fit policies. And this is, I would say it again, it's almost mission impossible, but I think it's also a very interesting element for reflection from this discussion. Second issue is the idea that monitoring per se is not enough. So monitoring needs to feed in other evaluation and assessment process, because this is where we can bring some more information to the table and have more meaningful discussion using the evidence that is available by the monitoring, and looking at the impact that the policies that are put in place have on people, on people's lives, I would say, and on our communities. And I think this is a very interesting way of finalizing my, I think, 4 minutes. Okay, Simona? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. And I actually think that you got the first cup of the day. Is a mini cup, but you got it because it was not easy to sum up such an interesting and fruitful discussion in less than 5 minutes. So first cup goes to Carmo. If you want a cup, be short, keep it short and simple, and you will get your own cup. Having said that, I would super quickly pass the floor to Mircea Badescu. I see there was an interesting question coming from the question and answer section. Would you like to read us the question, comment it? You have 3 minutes if you want your cup. And if you want a coffee, because coffee break is coming just in a second. Floor is yours.
I think, thanks, Simona. I think we are in this unbelievable situation in which it's not that we have millions of questions or comments. So either the panelists were very clear and very, very prepared, or I leave you guessing the other options. So the comment one was on data availability, and I think that it's a relevant one. One of our participants indicated the data availability as a problem, and I think is what we are facing in ETF so far. And before I became a chat moderator, I was a statistician. So I think this is what I face in our current work, so to speak. It's not that you can engage in monitoring if you don't have the information available. So that's a very valid comment. The question, the only question, actually, it's about the experience of our speakers in measuring informal learning, and perhaps someone could help me to elaborate here a bit more on this question. Thank you. Back to Simona.
Okay, Mircea, I see you want a cup as well, and you got it. Good guy. Okay, thank you so much. So actually, what do we have before the coffee break? So what stays between now and the coffee break? Me, which is not the good news, in fact. No, actually, you don't have me, but you have a poll. You will find in your chat, actually, the link to Mentimeter, and the same is for our streamers from LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. So actually, you go there, you click on Mentimeter, and see if we wanted to keep you busy, actually, during the coffee break. We can now break. We can come back in 5 minutes, but please do fill the poll, stretch a bit, but do fill the poll, and we see each other back in 5 minutes. And if you want to see the results from the poll, you need to come back. Okay, so I see you all in 5 minutes. Continue to fill in the Mentimeter. We will see the results just after that. Thank you so much. And now we have a short video because we want to keep you busy from different perspectives. A video explaining the international conference week. See you in 5 minutes. From myself, Barba Mamma, Mihail, and Hugh, that's all. Thank you. Okay, we are unmuted. We are, I think, back. Let's see if our discussants are back. Just what we give 1 more minute because we are nice people. Okay, so if we are back, thank you back, Ahmed, thank you back, Elena, and thank you back all the others. I think that actually we can share the results from the poll. And I have a small challenge, actually a big challenge for Mihailo, to comment each of the answer with 5 words before passing the floor to next speakers.
It's 5 in total or 5 for each? That's
5 each. I want to be generous today.
That's my day. In any case, the first question we asked was whether your country collects and provides evidence about progress with reforms in education and training. So if you can look at this like in a positive or in a slightly more critical way, this graph, the positive message is that like the majority of people say, yeah, we kind of collect evidence, which is already good news, which is certainly a better option than not having any information at all. However, if you look at the middle response, yes, we collect, but if only if it's about good news, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the story that we heard also from Moscow, that in fact, yeah, we collect evidence, but only if we want to present things in a certain way. So there's an ample amount of distrust. So evidence, yes, but so what? You know, this is like the majority of people are actually asking this question. So what? We don't believe it anyway because it's only if it's about good things.
No, but excuse me, but 5 words. How do you count in your own country?
5 minutes. Sorry.
No,
okay.
5. No, just how do you count 5 words in your country? Because perhaps in Italy for us 5 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
In Bulgaria, the number 5 is very, very, very flexible.
Okay,
then. 5 anything.
So we go for a number 5 Italian style. So we see the next question and we use the 5 and I count. Go.
Now I'm stressed. Reading the question doesn't count. To the extent available, is such evidence trustworthy? Continuation of the mood, the sentiment from question 1, yeah, not really. So essentially, the majority of people don't believe the evidence. And here we're talking about evidence collected by authorities.
Very good. Is improving. First and last, I give you 7.
Thank you. Here, whether actually evidence is being used for new policies, are new policies evidence-based? So the answer is it depends. So if you really want to know the answer to this question, go and talk to the people in the country and invest more time. So reality is much more diverse and colorful than we anticipate.
Wow, you see how we can improve by doing and by making exercise. This is actually an achievement itself. I think I can actually pass back the floor to you to introduce the next session and the next speaker. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So we thought that, in fact, once we discussed data and process, and we came up with a number of interesting insights, and I'm really sorry for the limited time. We could have talked much more. In fact, we could have devoted the entire session to some of the statements we heard before. We thought that it's a very important question. What do we do with all this? Imagine a world in which data is clear, process is there, everybody's happy, we have all the stuff we need, and so what? And so in this session, we hope to discuss this kind of a phenomenon that, in fact, sometimes this process is not really linear. It's not like in real life, we decide about the indicators, we discuss the process, and once everything is there, we kind of look at how we're using it. Sometimes it goes the other way around. We know in advance how we want to use things, and from there we go backwards and have this kind of a selective approach to both the process and the data. So the question of what is necessary to, in fact, make the best use of what we have? I mean, as you know, monitoring is quite a substantial effort. It's not that easy sometimes. It costs money. It is really sometimes also highly complex. It would be a pity not to use the results. So what are the obstacles? Are there any good practices? And what exactly happens with the monitoring evidence once it has been collected? And what is this kind of a dynamic between its use, its collection, and the impact that we hope that the evidence will have, in fact, for policy improvement. So this is like the topic of the third session. And I'm very happy to have a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine, Tracy, who in one way or another has been working on these issues for a while now. Good to see you. And I better the sooner I stop, the more time you will have to speak. So the second I realize that, I'm about to stop. So Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mihailo, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I will share my screen with you to give you my talk. And sort of, you know, there's a lot of questions you asked. I don't feel like I will be able to answer them all in the time I have, but I'm hoping to provide interesting input for a discussion by the discussants. And the title is very deliberate, using evidence to improve the quality of education. Deliberate because when we're talking about sort of the mechanisms of monitoring and assessment, sometimes we lose sight of the ultimate goal, which is improving the quality of education. Right? Evidence is only as good as what it's used for. And so a reminder that at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is have the best quality education possible. I would like to advance my slide. There we go. So the OECD has worked on this, as Mihailo said, for a very long time. And work already 20 years ago, there were sort of 3 general points coming out of this, that looking at the review, in this case of OECD countries, there were in general low levels of investment in educational R&D. There were weak research, policy, and practice links. So we've talked a lot about policy, but very little about practice. And I'm curious as to hear more about that, because monitoring and evaluation and evidence is, of course, also used by teachers and instructors. And the third general point was that in general, at the countries that we were looking at, there was low system capacity, both for the kinds of methodologies that were available, but also for the mechanisms for translating that knowledge, the knowledge networks and the brokerage. And also then, of course, that last really key point, which is even if you do have an example that works well, how do you scale it up? And how do you sustain it across time? Because that in the end is the hardest part. So for today, in the time I have, I just wanted to make 3 main points. Oh, before I make that, just one other additional observation, which is since those kind of early comments, there's also been a major change, which has been referenced by previous speakers, but the whole explosion of evidence and data. There's also been the emergence of new actors. So Mihailo sort of portrayed the list of potential actors. And if we think about the internet and just Googling, we have instant access to thousands of research results, but there's in fact no clear recognition of the quality of those results. And the traditional gatekeepers like publishers or in a library or research institutes, those gatekeepers of quality are not necessarily used, both by policy and practice. And in fact, already in 2013, the spread of misinformation online ranked as one of 10 most significant issues facing the world. This is the World Economic Forum's risk list. We know that this has been clearly made obvious, but it also refers to issues around research and evaluation to understand what you can trust, what is good quality, and how to use it. And so the 3 points I wanted to make, or the 3 challenges I wanted to put down, our work is looking at OECD countries, and I'm very interested to hear from your context how it resonates, whether it resonates at all. The first revolves around policy and politics. The second around whose voice counts. And the third is a lack of systemic vision for not just evidence gathering, but its use. So just very quickly turning to the first challenge, policy and politics. If we look at this slide, which is essentially sort of a very basic thinking about what a policy cycle might look like, you start with identifying needs and you develop it and implement it. Evaluation and monitoring comes towards the end of that process, right? And all of it is based on a knowledge base. The knowledge base itself, we have to admit, can be made up of many, many things, both some explicit sort of research knowledge, which we've been talking about, but also tacit knowledge. And it can come from research, it can come from professional expertise, but it can also come from personal anecdotes, and it can come from other sources. And it's not clear that we have a very good system for sort of understanding when and where to use things and which ones count more than others, etc. So one question, if we look at this from a politics perspective, and we heard a little bit about politics in the previous session, but basically because evaluation and monitoring is at the end of this cycle, what we're seeing often is that decisions about whether to fund something for another cycle usually take place. There hasn't been time to do the evaluation, in fact. So the time it takes to run a monitoring, the time it takes to do good evaluations, in fact, don't map at all onto the policy cycle, and even less onto a political cycle where an elected official has 2 or 3 years to sort of show the impact and the improvements that have been generated by a spotlight policy that they wanted to enforce. And so this is a reality. We have to accept it, but we need to think about what this means also for our expectations of evaluation and monitoring systems. So that's a first challenge. A second challenge is this understanding of whose voice counts. And, you know, in the old days, i.e. sort of 20 years ago, there was this idea of sort of researchers and policymakers and practitioners. And Mihailo has very nicely sort of laid out your sunshine map, which I liked very much. And here's just breaking it down a bit more to think of sort of researchers and who the actors might be in both the production of knowledge and the use of knowledge. And in addition, we've got external actors, especially labor unions, for example, of teachers, but also in the vet system, many others. But we've also got companies, right? We've got training providers, we've got material providers, publishers, we've got private entities, we've got parents and communities, and we have the media. And all of these players have their vested interests, which is legitimate because they each come to the table with their own interests. But the point is that if we're thinking about whose voice counts, we have to think about what does this mean for using evidence, particularly because at this point we've seen a beautiful illustration from our UNESCO colleague of just how much data is there, not just the systematic gathering of data, but new forms of information from AI and big data, for example, super useful. But the volume makes it very hard to use. And I'm talking not about, you know, the sort of leaders in the field. I'm talking about in decentralized countries, a school board or a parent, because these are also users of data and monitoring and evaluation data. And so while the volume and availability is in many cases a good thing, it's not clear that it's usable. And I don't think that we've spent enough time as a system thinking about how to make it usable. And in fact, one of the things that's really on the agenda now is moving from a push idea where if you just put the data out there, it will be used, to a pull agenda where it's thinking about, you know, is the monitoring, evaluation, and other forms of data available? Is it accessible? Can it be used? Is it understandable? Because honestly, big data and all the data forms that you get, very few people can actually use it and uncode it. Secondly, do they have the skills that they need and the capacity to use it in this pull model? And lastly, the interaction piece. Is interaction between the players facilitated? And I'm going to come back to that later because that's actually a really, really fundamental element. The third challenge I wanted to pose was the lack of systemic vision for the use. We see a lot of vision for sort of the gathering of data, but how is it going to be used? We've got capability, motivation, opportunity. This is a busy slide and I won't unpack it all, but just to give you some examples, if we think about capability, for example, we have the skills that I mentioned, but also the interaction. This doesn't sound very technical, but in fact, this is what makes it work. Trusted relationships, collaboration, social influence, understanding the human element. And Mihailo, you sort of gave a demonstration of what happens if the human element, in fact, doesn't trust the process. It's a very different kind of issue. Similarly, with motivation, it's about communication and access, etc., but also standards. So what do we expect in terms of the quality of the evidence, but also the quality of the use? And that is a huge issue, actually. And we can play this out for opportunity too, but I won't go into it because I know we're sort of pushed for time. So just to finish with one last slide, looking at sort of some examples of how this works in 3 different OECD countries. I'd be very interested to hear your reflections from your countries. But thinking through what this might actually look like on sort of a systematic scale, And the US is a very, a very particular example. It's this very delivery-oriented, demand-driven. They have a what works clearinghouse. There's a legal obligation to use qualified evidence, and qualified evidence here is usually randomized controlled trials. So it's a very specific form. It's very focused on rigor, and it's very rational. So it doesn't really include this human interaction so much. This can be contrasted, for example, to the UK, or actually mostly England, which is a bit more holistic. So they've created evidence centers. One example is the Education Endowment Foundation. And they really work, for example, with research schools to build capacity, but also to work in classrooms with the users of research and monitoring data to say, is this meeting your needs? And how can we help you if not? So there is a focus on rigor and relevance, and there is rational learning, but there's also a heavy collaborative piece. And the third example is from the Netherlands, which is much more about partnering. They have a national initiative for education research, and here it's focused on teachers, but you can also apply it to policy. But it's about reflective practitioners, focus on relationships, collaborative learning, but also social learning, and the understanding that for policymakers and practitioners, the use of evidence is also a social endeavor as well as a technical endeavor. And that's partially what makes it work, but it can also introduce weaknesses in the system. So I will stop there. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your discussion and comment.
So thank you very much, Tracy, for this very interesting and enlightening presentation. Before I turn to our discussions, I just have a comment. It's what I really, following your presentation, what I had in mind is something that is very important also when we consider and think about the use of monitoring or assessment or any kind of evidence, is that there is no use of evidence that can go without what we could call a horizon of reception. So what kind of evidence will be relevant, credible, acceptable for different kind of people based on a number of aspects, from the kind of the background, their even academic background. We know the difficulties sometimes for people coming from a qualitative background, so to say, to use quantitative or to be fully convinced by everything. That would be too much quantitative. That's just an example. But this horizon of reception of any kind of evidence, I think, is really very, very important. And that's what I had in mind. It might not have been the fil rouge of your presentation, but that's really something I think that needs to be considered. So now I would like to turn on to our discussions once again. And here again, you might want to comment and come up with different points. But I have a question for you, which is, what kind of, let's say, to be blunt, obstacles to the use of evidence coming from monitoring processes, but maybe not only, to the use of evidence in decision-making, do you see in the context in which you work? So obstacles to the use of evidence in the decision-making process. So here again, the floor is yours. We have another, I think, 25 minutes, maybe 20 minutes for this discussion. So, I mean, you have time, but try not to be too long if you can.
Let's say 15, so we make 15. A challenge on you.
So now I see Pedro first. Pedro, please.
Okay, I'll be a bit telegraphic because I don't want to see the evil puppet again. So I would say that, first big obstacle is lack of agreement on what are the outcomes. And I would suggest also, because the last presentation was very focused on formal education, I would again talk about the importance of lifelong learning, the whole of activities we're talking about, which at the end contribute to access to learning in general, decent work, livelihoods, and that's the ultimate impact we're talking about. But essentially, what we need to have an agreement between all the stakeholders regarding what are the relevant outcomes and how do you actually measure them. From our experience, what we see is that this works much better if it is associated with some sort of governance mechanism and a national strategy which tries to coordinate the efforts of all the players in the learning environment. So the schools, the VET institutes, the providers, the digital providers. So all the elements, the relevant elements of the ecosystem. And also what we have verified in the experiences we have documented is that it's useful that these mechanisms promote interministerial coordination, they engage the social partners actively, and eventually even unite under a shared forum with some sort of formalized responsibilities to watch over the system. Just very briefly, also in terms of relevant integration policy processes, what this helps is to have a sort of formal feedback mechanism that feeds the results of the monitoring into the relevant policy processes, into the planning. And if there is impact evaluation, also feeds the results of the impact into the design and implementation of new programs, which is also a key aspect. Also, if you do have a certain level of formalization, you can have an authority which can regularly review the guidelines associated with existing programs. You can have, let's say, a regular review of all the ecosystem and how well it's working. I mean, there are certain examples we have documented, like CNEFOP in France, the Education and Thematic Group in Jamaica, together with UNESCO. So I'll leave it at here so that this time I don't see the dark puppet.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Avis, and sorry if I mispronounce your name, please.
Thank you very much. Now your spelling, it was perfect. So thank you for that, because all the guys always confuse the way it is spelling. I'm Avis Giste. I'm the General Director of National Vet and Qualification Agency in Albania. I'm happy to be part of this panel and to share our experiences as well in this very important topic, which is monitoring. I feel optimistic, in fact, because we are using this exercise in Albania, and as well we are making use the results in order to improve the things. But I need to emphasize one thing, which I think it's really important. When we enter into this type of exercise, the monitoring, we need to have a clear aim in our mind. What are we going to monitor, and what are the results that we need to take in order then to assure that the progress is going in the right path and is contributing to the overall development phases. In Albania, in fact, we have introduced the strategy for employment and skills in 2014, but it has been more than 1 year a process of monitoring where the VET system and labor market system was, and how to put the priorities for, let's say, the period to come till 2020. And I think it was a good exercise in terms of the way it was implemented, because it consisted in a desk research review by taking into consideration statistical data, but as well the perception of the needs of the stakeholders for the information, because it is also important to know what are the needs of different stakeholders on the information that need to be used for their purposes in order to contribute to the system, but as well to benefit from the system. And afterwards, I think that, let's say, the value for that process was a participatory, let's say, principle, because during during the process, all the stakeholders were involved in order to consult not only the findings of the desk research, but as well to put 4 priority pillars for the strategy, and as well to agree on the working plans dealing the activities, the timeline, and the performance indicators that also was agreed through all the stakeholders. And one thing is important. So this exercise is not finalized in this moment. Then we started to monitor the strategy. So every year we introduced a progress report with, let's say, a specific methodology in order to find out where is the state of play of progress. Okay, I know I have to be fast, and how to and how to deal with the gaps of that. And I think that this was really useful. And together with a midterm review of the strategy, we had a basic information in order to introduce changes in our, let's say, first strategy. So in this moment, we have adopted an extended strategy till 2022, which has revised the activities and as well the indicators that need to be fulfilled for the upcoming years, in order that we have a progress that is also reflecting the status of development of the policies, but as well the implementation of the relevant institutions in Albania. We have obstacles, for sure we have obstacles, and this is linked with availability of data, but something that we have evidenced through these years is that we need as well to make use a lot of consultation process with relevant stakeholders. And I think this is giving an added value in the way we are approaching to the monitoring process per se, but as well in using the monitoring results for improving the initiatives in Albania. And thank you.
Thank you very much
for extending a bit.
Thank you for sharing your experience. Raul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just briefly coming again into this, or trying to zoom into the lifelong learning approach. And there were some nice experiences that to monitor lifelong learning in different countries. And I remember this one of the CLI in Canada in 2009. They developed an index very much based on the 4 pillars, the lower pillars, learning to be, to do, to know, to live together. And they developed 17 indicators and they started working with that. Then we had the experience of in Europe with ELI, which is the same principle with 37 indicators. So that these developing indicators, which is also following Singapore, is quite interesting, and I think we need to learn some lessons on that basis. And it will be for me something to take from this developing of index, that in order really to make monitor results useful, they should be tied to a plan to establish or to strengthen a lifelong learning system at given levels. No, could be national, could be institutional, could be local, and of course with the different stakeholders and voices of society, including of course the learner itself. Another important point is that at the national level, this could mean integrating monitoring measures into action plans or implementation strategy for the operation of implementation of a national policy learning, ensuring indicators that address this lifelong learning vision set in the policy decree. At the local level, which we could see also these very nice experiences in learning cities, the very interesting program that we're developing in UNESCO, through monitoring measure could be part of a plan to develop a local level lifelong learning system and design accordingly to indicators monitoring lifelong learning development. At the institutional level, monitoring results could be used to prove progress towards the objectives of an institutional strategy for lifelong learning. Indicators to measure an increase in community engagement or a widening of access for non-traditional students. More broadly, the results derived from a monitoring index for lifelong learning can be used to highlight gaps, flaws in the system of lifelong learning provision. Of course, proper communication should be involved in regular reporting of monitoring results in the context. Responsibility should be clearly indicated, etc. I will stop it here.
Thank you, Raul. I'm sorry, Ahmed and Elena, the pressure will again be on you. But this time, Ahmed, you're the first one. Please, 2 minutes each.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tracy, very much for the presentation. I think just answering your question about obstacles for using and monitoring evidence or results, one of the key issues, again, we refer to is this issue of fragmentation. The fact that a lot of people are bringing out results, you may not be knowing it, so there's no holistic overview, and you, in some cases you understand you know the results by coincidence and not in a systematic way. So this is one issue. Transparency between organizations, different organizations in the results. This is also one issue. And also the mindset. Sometimes you need to change the mindset from being seeing M&E as an accountability issue, not a lessons learning, and using this to improve and to advance the system. So sometimes this mindset makes it a really big problem. Thank you.
Finally, Elena.
Sorry, cap for Ahmed. Elena, I'm sorry, I have a cap here for Ahmed. You were cut before, and now you are very short. Elena, all the pressure is on you now. Go.
Okay, thank you. I'm also trying to respond to Hugh's question about the use of evidence in decision making. Even when monitoring is done perfectly well, sometimes the outcomes of monitoring on a particular factor contradict the outcomes of a different thing. For instance, if we discover that student performance is growing steadily, academic performance, but the well-being of students in schools is decreasing, how do you make a decision then? Politicians are very likely to go for academic outcomes because these are easily portrayed. But if the well-being of students in a school or an educational institution is low, they may have less motivation for lifelong learning subsequently. So it's always, well, a trade-off as to which indicator you are going for, and in order to make your decision. So this is something that needs to be debated from my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Simona.
I think we have still run it with the analogical finger and not with the digital hand. So
sorry, I was waiting for a digital. Please go ahead.
Okay, I can use the digital also.
No, go ahead.
I think in our country, one of the most problem is when we make innovation in education, we make islands of innovations. Some schools, some places, they make innovation education, or they make very beautiful things that everyone look at it and come to see it, and it's a model, but it's only an island. And what we have to see is to change from an island or islands of innovations and islands of best education, of best practices, to a systematic way of working. And I think maybe it's our problem because, you know, we're a startup nation and we want to go very, very fast and to change and to go to the next step. But if we want to change from islands of innovation to a real systematic way and for scalability and all the system work the same, we must use evidence, and we not only have to collect them, because we collect a lot of evidence, but all the policymakers should make the conclusions and see how they can work according to the evidence. I think one of the most obstacles in collecting data is the time. It takes a lot of time, and someone admitted here before that if we want to have very good data and very holistic, and the data that is should be very, very good, it takes a lot of time. And if we get data 3 years after the change you make, it's not relevant anymore, because our life today is very, very quickly, and changes going very, very quickly. So we have to find ways to pass this obstacle by trying to give data quicker, to make it very quick results. Sometimes we should pay that the data won't be perfect. And it's hard to say, but I think we must make this mindset. People were talking about mindset, that sometimes you pay that the data is not perfect, that the data is not all what you want to get, it's some, but you can use it on real time so that the changes of the policy, the changes of the education way of learning, and also the lifelong learning with all the ecosystem that work together should be very quickly, very clear, not very complicated, because people today, they are not ready to read a lot and take big books of data understanding. It should be clear cut and quick so that we can use it. And another point that I think that it's not nice to say, but the media and the international assessment give a lot of pressure on the policymaker to use evidence. And for example, the PISA of the OECD, it's something that pushes us to take and to use the monitoring and to collect evidence. And the media, when they say that this school or these cities have to improve itself, and they show the data at the media, it's pushed the policymaker to make a change and to take to account the data. They can't ignore it anymore, because when it's come to the media, they have to use it and to think according to the data and change their policy. Thank you.
Thank you. So we only have 7 minutes left, so I turn on to Simona to tell us what's left on our menu.
Allora, well, we have a long menu still. No, we'll try to be super short with a quick exercise with all of us discussing. So it would be nice to have all of us spotlighted as many as we can, of course, according to technicalities. I have a question for all of you. You have very few words. You know, here I have a brain. Used a lot of your brains. We used a lot of your brains. It was super useful, this discussion. So I have a question for you. My takeaway from this session is, if you ask me, Simona, which I'm not an expert on monitoring at all, I would say manipulation of data for the good and not for the real. And I grant to myself 2 takeaways. Island of innovation. I loved it. Allora, now the floor is yours. 3 words from now, one after the other. Whoever wants to start. My takeaway from the session is, before we move to the conclusion, go. Pedro, it's like in school here. Habibi, it's difficult.
The takeaway from the session is that we need relevant data, which displays causality between policy and impacts. We need agreement on what are the relevant outcomes at national level to encourage wide participation with clear assignment of responsibilities. Also, we didn't talk much, but was touch a bit on the issue of limitations of time, But we could have also mentioned limitations of money. But so resources are also important, and we need to have something which is adequate to context so that the data is produced in a timely way and relevant way. Okay, I'll stop here.
Excellent. Next, Elena, Avis, Carmo, Mircea, Yasminka.
I can say that what I took from this discussion, first of all, that we have to collect data and monitoring also from the informal education and not only for the formal education. I think it's very important. And another important thing is that we should collect data from all the stakeholders, but we also have to share with the stakeholders when we want to use this data and use the evidence for change the policy.
Excellent. Next.
Yes, can I? Okay.
Go.
I believe that one of the important messages that actually Tracy brought in is to decide which data takes precedence in our decision making. And this is very important to be clear about that. Also, I liked what Ronnie had said about media and the way media pressurizes decision makers in certain dimensions, not necessarily the most important ones. I like peace though, but there are other cases when the media is pressing us on something that we don't want to do. And the third message is about different providers of data and how you can reconcile what they are about and make decisions on the basis of different information, sometimes contradictory information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One more takeaway. First come, first serve before conclusion.
I'll
Avis
go.
and Mircea.
Sorry. I'll go quickly just to read the comment in the chat, which I think is very, very interesting, is to develop a monitoring culture and to match the needs of the countries, the developing and the developed countries. And my take is let's work together and let's do the data collection and the data monitoring together for a scope of the partner countries, not for the scope of the ETF necessarily. Thank you.
Bravo, Avis, Ahmed, the really last two. I'm very generous today.
Okay, I will keep short this time. Okay, I think this is important. Clear monitoring goals, a good inventory of data, and a good mapping of all the relevant stakeholders in order to be part of the monitoring process. Thank you.
Excellent, Ahmed. So we put all the pressure on Yasminka as the last one.
Okay, I
think, Ahmed.
Yeah, the two takeaways I think were interesting from Tracy's presentation. The slide about the different users of monitoring and evaluation. It's not just about the decision makers and really going down deeply. And the second one is also about the characteristics in terms of the methodology for different countries. She mentioned 3 countries which have really different characteristics of how and why they use their M&E systems. Thank you.
Okay, Ahmed won't win the cup again. You got it one already, eh? Allora, Yasminka, all pressure on you. And after Raul, go.
I need to reflect actually to go further on what Mircea said, because I said that we need to develop the monitoring culture. And I really think that it's important that all of us know that monitoring is not to serve only for assessment if activities are completed or outcomes achieved and tick the box, but also for planning some corrective activities, identification of issues to be addressed strongly or differently, and to support better policy formulation. And something that is at the same time, and this is the second thing, which is not encouraging, is the fact that we have that all of us have the same or similar challenges. especially those related to informal education. But the optimistic side of it is that if we have the same challenge, probably all our brains can find solutions. So I'm convinced that we will find good solution and that we will succeed in.
Raul, take your brain and go, 30 seconds.
Very fast, just to take this systemic vision that was shared on motivation, opportunity, that was raised. And the last point is that monitoring results need to be tied to a plan.
Excellent. Hugo, Mihailo, 1 second, always less.
All right. I think that Hugo is much better than me in making the final conclusions, because I always kind of forget fixations on these kind of details. This is super interesting and that's super interesting, and by the time I'm finished, my time is over always. So I just wanted to say that what is really important, it looks like a little bit contrary to our first impulse when we talk about monitoring, which is to discuss what kind of data, how we collect it, how we analyze it and stuff. In reality, now the real question is something that Tracy also started with. How do we build an economy of use? How do we actually focus on this kind of a demand or pull side, which is in fact always neglected? So this is going to take some time. And of course, it's going to take a lot of effort to actually change the attitude and the mindsets of people, because usually when you talk about monitoring and evidence, we always have this tendency to focus on the first two questions that we discussed today: what kind of evidence and what is the process, whereas the use somehow stays in the end. It's a little bit like if we do a job properly and have the right data, somehow life is going to take care of things and everything's going to work out. So 2 sentences: less data but used well is certainly better than having all kinds of stuff which is simply ignored and on the shelf. I mean, my shelf at home is full of books and data that nobody is looking at. And so, yeah, essentially, I end with what I started. It's all about people. And there's actually a voodoo doll. You have no idea what will happen to me after this.
Okay, Hugo, from Barba Mama to Hugo.
Yeah, very quickly. So while I was listening to all of you from the very beginning, I figured out something like, just an image, of course, with all the biases that I should assume, is that a monitoring system in any country or any context even is somewhere in the middle of a square, you know, and the elements of the square, one would be feasibility. The other one would be acceptability, and probably social and political acceptability. The other element would be relevance, and with relevance, I put all of the technicalities, availability of data, and so on. And the last one would be precisely the use or usefulness. How is it going to be used? And I think depending on all the particular color or taste of all these 4, I don't know how to say that, walls, let's say, in every particular context, your dot, which is your system, will be a little bit different, you know, more useful, or, you know, you have to go to more what is feasible, this kind of thing. So the nature, what you can build really depends on the 4 walls that you have in a particular context. And these are the 4 walls. And to finish with, I think what also Tracy said in one of her slides is also very important. And I think is another element within which we should frame any kind of monitoring process, which is the explosion of available evidence. And I think it's very true. And we all know that in this world of information tends to be overwhelming. So that's one of the other points to take into consideration. I'm done.
Okay, so I think that from all of us, actually, you see, actually, we are all together. So from all of us, a big thank you. I think it was a very fruitful discussion, and I think we can release you. 4 minutes delay, but I think it was worth. So thank you so much for all of us. See you soon. Please continue to follow us also for our streamers. We still have tomorrow 2 more thematic sections, skills for on and greening, and then the big high-level event with fireworks on Thursday and Friday morning. From all of us, thank you so much. Shukran, merci, spasiba, au revoir. Thank you. Thanks a lot. We close.
Sì, metto la slide.
Thank you to all the discussants. Actually, I'm sorry to put pressure on you, but it was not me, it was Barba Mamma, you know. So we are manipulated by a superpower here. Thank you. Thanks, Karma, Mihalce, and thanks, Rahul and Michi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Very much.
See you next time. Ciao.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
Sì.